Hello and welcome to another episode of Coptic Ambassadors. This program was designed to recognise many of our Coptic community members who have made a recognisable difference. And today we are absolutely thrilled, blessed and honoured to have Mr. Nagib Kaldas with us. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thanks for having me.
And I think it goes without saying, Nagib has been everywhere within the police force in New South Wales, but across international waters and borders, and has made an incredible difference to not only our community here in Sydney, Australia, but abroad. I think what we know and most notable achievement to date of Nagib is he as a former Deputy Police Commissioner, a role in which he held for over a decade or just to a decade, managing 14,000 staff and a budget of 2 billion Australian dollars. That's no mean feat there. But before that, he had a place and an executive position in many different organisations within the force, from counter-terrorism, major crime investigation, homicide, armed robbery, and to say I've condensed that from maybe a CV of around 14 different squads. From there, more recently, I'm looking down to make sure I quote it correctly, Nagib led the United Nations investigation into the assassination of the Lebanese Prime Minister Hariri, a truly historical investigation, as well as from there leading the joint investigative mechanism into the use of chemical weaponry in the Syrian conflict. Continuing, if we can, briefly in talking to a bit of his bio on the international scene, Mr. Kaldas currently serves on the Board of Commissioners of the Commission for International Justice and Accountability, looking at investigating the atrocities within the Syrian and other conflict zones, as well as looking at even within Ireland, Northern Ireland, and working with Scotland Yard. Now, I could go on and on and on, but I think what we want to know today is how he was able to accomplish all of this in his 42 years and counting, working to help our community, the community of Australia and the community internationally. Wow, when did you have time to rest?
Well, after that introduction, I can't wait to hear myself. So thank you. Look, I think I'm a really ordinary man who probably found himself in a couple of extraordinary places at extraordinary times and simply did what needed to be done. We migrated here in 1969. I was 12 years old with my family, and I probably always wanted to join the police force. And a lot of my family have said to me, we always knew you would do it, so I did. All those years ago, 42 years ago, and I simply stuck with it for as long as I could.
Yep. You know, when we're young at primary school, we often say, I want to be a policeman or a firefighter or a pilot. And for many, that's just a bit of a dream. And for you, you know, you've held on to it and you were able to accomplish so much over that time. I really would love to know, what is it that influenced your decision to initially join the force?
I think there's probably many things. One is, I think it's a job where you get up in the morning and you think you're going to help people all day, rather than perhaps something that's more mundane. Most days that is the case. Some days it's not. It's bureaucratic and can be quite stifling. But by and large, I think police do a very good job in Australia. I think the vast majority are incredibly well motivated and you know, really altruistic, trying to achieve good things for the communities they serve.
I think it was a question that's on a lot of our mind is, you've come to Australia, you migrated back what year was it, did you say? It was
1969, yeah.
Was being a Middle Eastern Egyptian male at the start of your career, was that something that, was it difficult? Was it, how did you manage to kind of adjust yourself and police those who, probably not as many of us Middle Easterners now as they were back then?
There certainly weren't many in the police force. In fact, there weren't many migrants really in the police force. You had, you know, the odd Italian or Greek or whatever, but the bottom line is, you just have to have faith. You have to believe in what you're doing. And if you get called names in the street or in the station, in the mealroom, you can either laugh it off or you can let it upset you and spend hours sort of stewing over it. I choose to put it behind me, try and right the wrongs if I could, but by and large, I think I survived pretty well.
Yeah. I think you did. I think your career, having been involved in so many different aspects, what have been some of the highlights and lowlights? It's so hard to pinpoint a particular type of, if it's the homicide or if it's robberies or if it's counter-terrorism. What would you recall as being some of those?
Probably my time in the homicide squad, which is over a decade. In the last 4 years or so, I was actually the commander, so I was the boss. I was in charge of all the murder investigations across the state. And we worked with other states, and sometimes the jobs cross over borders and so on. The suspects certainly cross over borders and what have you. I think we did a lot of good in that space, and I guess I gravitate towards jobs that may be very difficult, but the sense of satisfaction you get when you succeed is greater.
Okay.
Certainly murder investigations at the top of the pile. And in many ways, when I was asked by the United Nations to head up the investigation into the assassination of the Lebanese Prime Minister, and there were 20-odd other murders as well, that over a 4-year period that had occurred and were unsolved, I saw that as a real challenge. And it's the first time the United Nations actually investigated a murder, established a tribunal, a specific murder, and established a tribunal. And we indicted 5 people. They were all Hezbollah members. And 1 died, and the 3 of the 4 were convicted ultimately. Wow. It was an interesting dynamic. Prior to that, I had spent the best part of a year in Iraq in 2004, and then went back in 5. I was on loan from the state police to our federal government and deployed to Iraq as part of the coalition.
I see.
To rebuild the Iraqi police. And I thought Iraq was complicated because it had 3 main groups, the Sunnis, the Shiites and the Kurds. When I got to Lebanon, I realised there's 17 different sects. And on any given day, the allegiances were somewhat shifting. There were a lot of people that wanted the tribunal investigating the murder of Prime Minister Hariri. They wanted it to succeed. But there were many also who wanted it to fail. Okay. So it was a tough environment. Operationally, there are some areas of Lebanon that we really couldn't go. The last assassination or murder out of the list that we had that were possibly connected was a fellow who would have been one of my staff, probably my deputy. He was killed in a car bomb a few months before I got there. So I realised before I went that it was a somewhat dangerous mission. But I was a volunteer. Nobody forced me to do it. None of these things, nobody ever forced me to do anything. So you can't complain.
Yeah. I must ask, as you say that there's a challenge, yes, but getting justice, is that a driving force behind your desire to put yourself in somewhat vulnerable situations as well? And especially, that's a great example, 17 different sects, who would have thought? But is your desire for justice something that overpowers and keeps you focused and keeps pushing forward? Yeah,
very much so, very much so. We wrote into the charter of the Special Tribunal for Lebanon that we must help end the cult of impunity. So there's like a culture of impunity where people were being killed and no one was being held to account. And I'm happy to say that once we began serious investigation into these murders, the assassinations actually stopped. There have been a very small number in more recent times, but after 4 years of quite dreadful murders, I hope and pray that we contributed towards stemming that tide.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's, I'd love to understand, you are a Coptic Orthodox Christian, and I would love to know how your faith supported you in bouncing back from probably you've seen and heard of things that many of us in our lifetime won't. How did it help you become resilient?
It was certainly crucial, not only in my development, but I think in my resilience, mainly in my resilience. Yeah. If you are going, Winston Churchill used to say, if you're going through hell, keep going, being that you come out the other side, obviously. Some of these jobs were quite difficult. They're very difficult,
Yeah.
with a lot of people wishing you to fail, a lot of people putting hurdles in your way, a lot of people saying bad things about you. You never get immune to that. It still stings sometimes when people do and say things to you and say things very unfair sometimes, very untrue as well. But you just have to plough on, have faith, surround yourself with good people, give them what they need, give them direction, and don't compete with them.
How did you feel the hand of God in your kind of career journey to date? With all these executive positions that you've held and influence that you've been able to make. No doubt God would have been a part of that. I would love to understand from you how you saw that unfold.
I think everything that's happened to me sort of, I've been in the hands of God, and when things do get difficult, like all Christians, I say, well, you put yourself in the hands of God and you pray and you hope everything comes out all right, and it has. I think the reason I'm still here, even though I've been in some fairly physically threatening situations, too many unfortunately, is because God has looked after me, and my faith has sustained me.
Yeah, I think beautiful words, and I even reflect back to your earliest times when you were probably the first respondent to an incident. In those times where not all, rosy red. You're seeing some of the most difficult people at their worst, really.
Yeah.
In those times, what was your motivation to really push on? And then over those years, obviously, you've then achieved great success, landing roles in executive positions. But at that time, where, as you say, probably the physicality was there, and you were seeing that. If you could help us understand what was going through your mind at those stages earlier.
You obviously train and you practice and you do drills and you become good at handling weapons and special tactics and all of that sort of stuff. I spent about a decade it's a part-time role as a hostage negotiator, and I've been lucky to train. I've done the FBI training program as well as all the Australian courses and all of that. And they teach you basically when you go to a scene and the adrenaline really takes over, it's pumping, that you've got to maintain your cool, you've got to focus on what it is you're there to do, and ultimately is to protect people and property obviously, but people mainly, both the public as well as your workmates and yourself. You're no good to anyone if you're dead. It tends to be something that police, it becomes second nature. The things you have to do in a crisis, if you do it often enough, it becomes second nature. And you just have to keep your wits about you. And certainly as far as the police go, you look after each other as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Would you say the concept of being part of a team is something that resonates and has supported you in your success to date? Very,
very much so. In fact, I think probably the thing I enjoyed the most about working in places like Homicide and the Armed Robbery Squad is the team, the camaraderie, the knowledge that others you're not alone no matter what happens. People passed away, people had financial problems, all of these issues. That camaraderie has seen a lot of people through, and I was very happy to be a part of that. And I must confess, when I did leave the police after all those years, almost 3.5 decades or so, it's the thing you miss. It's like being part of a tribe or a family, and then all of a sudden you're removed after all these years. It's an adjustment that we all have to make, but by the same token, I didn't look back. I wanted to look ahead. I had other things I wanted to do. Immediately after I finished with the police, I deployed with the United Nations again to investigate the use of chemical weapons in the Syrian conflict. That kept me busy, and again it was a little bit touchy. And then after that I was offered another job with the United Nations as the Director of Oversight for UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, which is a United Nations agency that was set up initially temporarily in 1948 to look after the issue of Palestine refugees. Here we are all these years later, and it's still there. 70-something years later, regrettably. But it was something that, again, I mean, all of these things that I think I've been lucky to be selected for and to do, I felt they were worth doing, they were worthwhile. And this really was the top of the pile. in terms of helping refugees in 5 countries: Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Gaza and the West Bank, where all the Palestine refugees are. It's around 5.5 million. Wow. I learned a great deal, and I think one of the things, you take away something from every role that you have, but with the job working, for the Palestine refugees, one of the things it did for me is it's just reinforced or reaffirmed how lucky we are in Australia and how blessed we are.
Yeah, it's I think as I said, many of us don't get this experience at all to understand what it's like to not only serve your other, your brothers and sisters here locally, but to do it when they're in a vulnerable position over there. I can only imagine its impact that it has had on you.
Yeah. I mean, I guess the police in particular prepares you for a lot of these roles that I've had, because, as you said earlier, and you're absolutely right, you tend to see humanity at its worst. In domestic violence, in robberies and sex abuse and murders, but you also see humanity at its best. Yep. People who are very brave and do things in a crisis situation, trying to help others and save others. People who go out of their way to help others, despite risk to themselves, physical or otherwise, reputational, whatever it might be. You tend to see humanity, the broad range of what humanity is capable of. Okay. And there's a lot of good, and you can't focus on the bad, and you have to see that there's a lot of good in people and try and help.
Yep, absolutely. No, you've well said. I think in your role, in the topic of seeing the good in people, you were essentially looking after the National Counter-Terrorism Committee for a period of 8 years. Can you elaborate on the role you played within that organisation and the influence, for me, I'm very interested in understanding the influence that religion had within these terrorist organisations. Is the idea of fighting for religion therefore skewed?
Definitely. So the National Counter-Terrorism Committee, which has changed its name now, it's the Australia-New Zealand Counter-Terrorism Committee, and each state and territory, so there's the 8 jurisdictions in Australia, are represented on it. Okay. And you usually have a senior police officer, usually the Deputy Commissioner, and a senior public servant, maybe second in charge of the Department of Premier and Cabinet or whatever it might be. Okay. And then there's a whole bunch of people from Canberra, from the federal structure. That committee is the primary policy-making body for Australia for counter-terrorism measures. It oversights all the training, the equipment purchasing, preparedness. Everything comes under one of 4 sort of mastheads. It's prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. Okay. Prevention, preparedness, response and recovery. And you're really making sure that all of the jurisdictions have all they need to prepare and to prevent and then to respond if they need to and then to recover, hopefully, if anything happens. And quite a few incidents and events occurred while I was on the committee, which were discussed. And as you mentioned, Simone, there are people in our communities who have become obsessed and have very skewed views of whatever religion it is, and it leads them down this road of hate, venom, and wanting to hurt as many people as they can. And there's really communities themselves and families have to be more involved perhaps than they have been in countering that and in keeping their youth on track. I did a review for the New Zealand Police after the Christchurch mosque attacks, and they did a tremendous job. They did an excellent job. It could have been much worse. But that just highlighted for me that the danger, you need to be aware, you need to be alert. Authorities have to be monitoring what's happening, both in social media in terms of engagement with the communities. I'll come back to that. But the engagement leads you to awareness, and then if you're aware, hopefully you will know what's happening before it happens. Yep. And certainly the Tarrant attack in Christchurch highlighted it can come from any direction. Yeah. Just on the engagement though, I just wanted to say that most of the information which has led to attacks being spoiled or stopped and people being arrested have come from the community. Wow. So it's really the community that accepts responsibility, and not just for its youth but for its members.
Yeah, right.
And then does the right thing by saying, I'm really worried about this person. He's in our midst, but he's behaving badly or behaving erratically, and having the courage to ring someone. but it's very difficult for people to contact the police or authorities and, you know, adopt someone in. This is why engagement is so important, and it's about making friends with communities at a time when there is no crisis. And then when the crisis comes, they know you, they trust you, they feel comfortable picking up the phone and talking to you, and you know what's going on. If you don't make that effort, and as a police officers, particularly the senior police officers, and you don't build those relationships with the communities that you serve in whatever area you're in, you can't go to people in the middle of a crisis and say, look, I haven't bothered to get to know you, but trust me and tell me everything you know. Sure. It's not going to happen.